Hey guys, tonight I want you to close your eyes for just a moment. Not yet. Not quite. First, I want you to picture a little girl, 9 years old, brown braids, stubborn chin. She has already watched grasshoppers eat an entire farm. She has already watched her baby brother take his last breath in a stranger's farmhouse. And right now, she's sleeping in the basement of a hotel in a town she's never been to before, listening to the sound of strangers walking on the ceiling above her. Somewhere upstairs, her father is mopping floors. Tonight, we are walking inside the year that Laura Ingalls Wilder spent 60 years trying to forget. The year that never made it into a single Little House book. The year she wrote down once, in private, in pencil, on cheap school tablets, and then buried so deep that America didn't find it until 2014. By the time this story's done, you will understand why she hid it, and I promise you, what she was hiding was not what you think. Now dim the lights. Let your shoulders drop, and let's walk together into the one chapter of American history that America's most beloved pioneer girl spent a lifetime pretending never happened at all. You're standing in a wheat field in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, in the summer of 1874. The air smells of warm earth and cuts grass. The sky above you is a wide, flat blue that goes on forever in every direction, the way only a prairie sky can. Under your feet, the soil is dark and rich and damp. Charles Ingalls worked this ground with everything he had. He broke it with a plough he could barely afford, and he nursed it through a cold spring. He watched it green up slowly, carefully, the way you watch something you have bet your entire future on. This field was not just a farm. It was the reason the family left Wisconsin. It was the reason they moved to Minnesota. It was the plan, the hope, the promise that the frontier had made to every family who was willing to risk everything and show up. And then you hear it. Not thunder, not wind, something else entirely. A sound like paper tearing very quickly, or dry leaves shaking all at once, or rain arriving from a direction that rain has no business coming from. You squint toward the western horizon. You see what looks like a cloud. A strange, pale, white-silver cloud that is moving too fast and sitting too low and making that wrong, papery rustling sound. Within minutes, it is overhead. Within an hour, the wheat field is gone. The Rocky Mountain locust, Melanoplus spretus, if you want the scientific name, which frankly sounds far too polite for what these creatures actually were, descended on southwestern Minnesota on June 12th, 1873, in what one farmer described as a big snowstorm, where the air was filled with enormous-sized flakes. Except the flakes had legs and appetites, and they were not done. These were not your ordinary garden-variety grasshoppers that hop around a vegetable patch and cause minor inconvenience. These were migratory locusts, the kind that moved in swarms so thick and dense that they blocked out the sun like a moving curtain drawn across the sky. Scientists would later estimate that a single swarm recorded in 1875 may have contained up to 12.5 trillion individual insects. Oh, the swarm itself stretched over 2,000 miles in length. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 12.5 trillion. On your crops, in your fields, on the handles of your tools, crawling into your house through the gaps in the walls. When these locusts landed on a Minnesota farm field, they did not nibble politely and move along. They stripped everything. The wheat, the oats, the corn, the barley, right down to bare, naked stalks in a matter of hours. And then, before they left, they did something even crueler. They burrowed into the soil, 6 to 12 inches down, and they laid their eggs. Which meant that even if you survived this year's plague, next year's destruction was already growing underneath your feet, waiting for spring, patient as death. And here is the detail that truly broke people. The fact that sits in your chest like a stone long after the story's over. They kept coming back, not for 1 year, not for 2. The Rocky Mountain locust plague ran from 1873 all the way through 1877. 5 consecutive years of crop destruction across Kansas, Nebraska, Dakota Territory, Iowa, Missouri and Minnesota. 5 years of waking up in the grey early morning and checking the sky before you looked at your family. 5 years of that wrong, papery, rustling sound arriving on the western wind. For the Ingalls family at their homestead claim near Plum Creek, outside Walnut Grove, the grasshoppers destroyed the harvest in 1874, and then again in 1875, 2 years in a row. The crops were gone. 2 years in a row, Charles Ingalls planted and prayed and watched the sky and lost. Now here is what you need to understand about Charles Ingalls, the peer of the Little House books, the fiddle-playing, joke-cracking, endlessly optimistic frontier father who makes every reader feel, from the very first page, that everything is going to be all right. He was a good man, a genuinely good man. But he was also a man who had borrowed money to plant those crops. He was a man whose farm, the homestead claim he had broken with his own bare hands, was now deep underwater in debt. He was a man with a wife, 3 young daughters, and a baby son only 9 months old, and no harvest to show for 2 years of labour. In the spring of 1876, Charles Ingalls faced the truth that the American frontier very rarely allowed you to face comfortably. He had failed. Not through laziness, not through poor character, not through bad choices. Through the collision of natural disaster and economic catastrophe that was quietly shredding thousands of frontier families at the exact same moment. Because while the grasshoppers were eating the crops, the panic of 1873 had already eaten the financial system that might have cushioned the blow. Banks were failing, credit had vanished, land values had collapsed, unemployment was climbing. Across Iowa alone, approximately 400 banks failed in 6 years. Farmers who had borrowed during the land boom could not repay. Foreclosures were stacking up across the prairie like snow after a blizzard. The frontier was not the land of limitless possibility that the railroad company posters had promised. It was, for thousands of families in 1876, a place where you could work yourself to the bone, plant in faith, pray in earnest, and still end up with nothing. The Ingalls family was not unusual in this. That is actually the most important thing to understand about this whole story. They were not exceptionally unlucky. They were not uniquely cursed. They were ordinary American frontier people living through an extraordinary convergence of catastrophe. The same catastrophe that was happening to their neighbours, to the family in the next county, to homesteaders from Minnesota all the way down to Kansas. But none of that made it easier to tell Caroline they were losing the farm. Let your shoulders drop here for a moment. Feel the weight of that conversation. Caroline Ingalls, steady, precise, the quiet and unshakable backbone of every single Little House story, had already moved this family from Wisconsin to Kansas, from Kansas back to Wisconsin, and from Wisconsin to Minnesota. She had already cooked and cleaned and kept house in a dugout hole carved into the side of a creek bank. She had already sewn clothes from worn-out fabric and made meals from almost nothing, and kept 3 little girls fed and warm through Minnesota winters. She had already watched the grasshoppers eat 2 harvests. Now her husband was telling her they needed to move again. This time to Iowa. This time to work in a hotel owned by a neighbour neither of them knew very well. This time with no plan beyond the offer itself, room and board and modest wages, and the hope that something better would come along. She said nothing sharp. The record does not give us a sharp word from Caroline Ingalls on this day. It gives us a woman who began quietly to pack. His name was William Stedman. He was from Walnut Grove, a neighbour, an acquaintance, the kind of man you exchanged a nod with at the grain mill and a few words with at church on Sunday. Not a close friend, not a stranger. The kind of man who exists in every small frontier town, steady and unremarkable and occasionally unexpectedly important. In the summer of 1876, Stedman had made a decision of his own. He was leaving Minnesota. He was buying a hotel in a small town called Burr Oak in the far northeastern corner of Iowa, right up against the Minnesota border. 3 miles from Minnesota, in fact. As if even moving away from home required staying close enough to still feel it. The hotel was called the Master's Hotel, sometimes the Burr Oak House. Built in 1856, back when Burr Oak was a genuine frontier crossing point. A stagecoach stops on the road between southern Iowa and the Minnesota Territory, busy enough in its day to support 2 hotels, several saloons, and a steady stream of travellers moving goods and cattle through the region. By 1876, that era was finished. The railroads had arrived and rearranged everything. Traffic that once moved slowly by wagon through Burr Oak now moved quickly by rail through other towns. Burr Oak had not grown with the region. It had, in the careful language of historical records, simply declined. The hotel Stedman was purchasing was a 1.5-story wood-frame building with a raised full basement, 11 rooms spread across 3 levels, sitting in a town that had already seen its best years come and quietly go. The basement held the kitchen and 2 dining rooms where the work of running a frontier hotel actually happened. The cooking, the washing, the hauling of water, the endless cycle of meals for travellers who expected to be fed on time, regardless of what the family in the kitchen was going through. The upper floors held the guest rooms, a parlour, a bar room for the steady trade that frontier saloons always maintained, even when everything else was slowing down. Stedman needed help running it. He thought of Charles Ingalls, a man handy with carpentry and repairs, reliable, hard-working, and as of 1876 without a farm. The offer was simple. Come to Burr Oak. Help manage the hotel. Bring your family. Room and board would be provided along with wages that would at least keep the family fed. It was not a generous offer. It was not a hopeful offer in any grand sense. It was the offer you accept when you have no other offer on the table and a family depending on you to come home with something. Charles said yes. They sold what they could from the Plum Creek claim. They packed what remained into the covered wagon. The same wagon that had already carried this family across Wisconsin, across Kansas, and back again, that had been their home and their vehicle and their last resort more times than any family should have to count. In the late summer of 1876, they pointed it east toward Iowa. Laura was 9 years old, Mary was 11, Carrie was 5, old enough to walk alongside the wagon when the road was smooth, young enough to be lifted in when her legs gave out. And their baby brother Freddie, born the previous November, was just 9 months old. A small boy with, as Laura would later write with the careful grief of someone choosing every word, never a healthy start. But they were not going straight to Iowa. There was a stop first. Charles's brother Peter lived in South Troy, a small settlement also known as Zumbro Falls, in Wabasha County, Minnesota. It was a natural place to pause on the journey east. Family. A proper roof. A few days of rest for a wagon-weary family before the road continued. They stayed longer than a few days. Charles helped Peter with the late summer harvest work, the way families did on the frontier. Labour shared freely, no account kept, everyone understanding that the favour would be returned in some form before the season turned. It was good work, honest work, the kind of work that reminded you that even in hard times, there were people who would help you keep going. And then Freddie got sick. Charles Frederick Ingalls, called Freddie, always Freddie, had been born November 1st, 1875 in Walnut Grove. The only son, the first boy in the family after 3 daughters, he had never been entirely well. Laura wrote later that he had never been a healthy baby, and the frontier gave very little quarter to babies who arrived in the world with fragile constitutions. The Wabasha County death records, when they were finally located and examined by researchers, listed his cause of death as diarrhea. The word recorded in the archaic shorthand of 19th century frontier documentation as diarrhea, which tells you something honest about the medical precision that was available on the frontier in 1876. There was no hospital. There was no physician within easy reach. There was a mother and a father doing everything in their power, and a small baby who was not getting better. On August 27th, 1876, at Peter Ingalls' farm in South Troy, Minnesota, Freddie died. He was 9 months and 26 days old. Laura wrote about this moment later in her private memoir, the one she called Pioneer Girl, the one she never published, the one America did not read until 2014. She wrote it with the plain, level grief of someone who has spent a very long time trying to find the right words for something that has no right words. But little brother got worse instead of better, and one awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. 9-year-old Laura. Standing in a farmhouse that was not her home, in a county she had only just entered, watching her baby brother go still, the particular absolute quiet of a room where someone has just stopped breathing. The way grief on the frontier had to be contained almost immediately, not because it was not real, not because the family did not feel it with everything they had, but because survival on the American frontier in 1876 simply did not pause and wait for you to finish grieving. You moved, you continued, you kept going, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something the frontier permitted. Freddie was buried on Peter Ingalls' farm. The exact location of his grave is unknown today. 12 years after his burial, the Zumbro River flooded the farm and destroyed it. There is no marker. There is no place you can visit and stand and feel the ground under your feet and know he is there. There's only a death record in a county courthouse, and one sentence in a private manuscript that spent over a century folded away in a box. Caroline Ingalls later said, and the sentence carries the specific weight of a door being gently, permanently closed. Everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. Historians have turned this sentence over carefully. Some read it as the natural expression of a mother's grief, the way loss always becomes a turning point in the story we tell ourselves, a before and an after, even when the structural forces bearing down on a family are far larger than any single life. Others read it more concretely. With a surviving son growing into the farm labour that frontier agriculture required, Charles Ingalls might have stayed in one place longer. He now might have built the kind of stability that the constant moving had always prevented. But perhaps it means something simpler, something more human than either historical interpretation allows. Perhaps it means that when your baby dies in your brother's farmhouse, on the road to a job you didn't want, in the middle of a journey you didn't choose, it becomes the fixed point around which everything else in your life gets arranged, whether you want it to or not. Everything measured against that August morning, every choice that followed carrying its shadow. Before Freddie, after Freddie. The family climbed back into the covered wagon. They had no choice. Burr Oak was waiting. The hotel was waiting. The debts were waiting. William Stedman was waiting. Your life on the American frontier in 1876 did not hold its breath for a grieving family to gather themselves. You moved. You kept moving. You carried your grief in the back of the wagon alongside everything else you owned. The quilts and the cast iron pot and the fiddle in its case. And you rolled east toward Iowa and whatever came next. Caroline did not complain. The record does not give us complaint from Caroline Ingalls. The record gives us a woman who packed and unpacked this wagon more times than any woman should ever have to, who buried a baby in a county she was already leaving, and who climbed back up onto that wagon seat and rode on. The books she would eventually inspire, 8 of them, beloved by millions, read by children for nearly a century, would never mention Freddie, would never mention this road, would never mention the August morning in South Troy, or the grief that rode east in the back of that wagon, or the fact that America's most famous pioneer family arrived in Burr Oak, Iowa, not as adventurers chasing a new horizon, but as people who had just buried their son and had nowhere else to go. That was the year Laura never wrote about, and we are only just beginning to understand why. The wagon rolled into Burr Oak in the fall of 1876. What waited for the Ingalls family inside that hotel basement was not a fresh start. It was something harder, smaller, and more complicated than any Little House book ever dared to describe. In Chapter 2, we walk through the door of the Master's Hotel, and we don't come out the same way we went in. The wagon rolled into Burr Oak, Iowa. In the fall of 1876, and the first thing Laura noticed was that the town smelled different from home. Not bad exactly, just different in the way that places are different when they do not belong to you. The air carried wood smoke and a river damp and something else underneath. Something sour and yeasty that she would only later learn to identify as the particular smell of a working saloon. She was 9 years old. She had never lived near a saloon before. She would remember this town as small and dirty. That is the exact phrase she used when she wrote it down, 60 years later, in the memoir she called Pioneer Girl, the one she never published. The one that sat in a box for decades while the rest of the world read the books she had carefully cleaned and pressed into something more presentable. Small and dirty. 2 words from a woman not given to unnecessary complaint. 2 words that tell you more than a paragraph could. You need to picture exactly where they were going to live. Not a house, not even a small house. One room. The Masters Hotel stood on the main road through Burr, a 1.5-story wood-frame building with a raised full basement that served as the working heart of the whole operation. The basement held the kitchen, the dining room where travellers ate, and a secondary dining area for regular boarders. Everything that kept the hotel running, every meal, every pot of coffee, every loaf of bread, every tub of washing up water, came out of that basement. That is where the Ingalls family lived. One room, behind the dining area, in the basement of a working hotel. Charles and Carolyn, Mary, Laura, and Carrie. 5 people, in a space designed for storage, not for sleeping, not for raising 3 children, not for any of the private dignities that a family needed to hold itself together. Above them, the floorboards of the main level creaked with the footsteps of paying guests. To one side, separated by a shared wall thin enough to hear every word, was the saloon. The saloon operated into the late hours of the night. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Because if you grew up reading the Little House books, if you fell asleep as a girl to stories of log fires and Pa's fiddle, and the vast quiet prairie surrounding a house that belonged to your family, then the image of Laura Ingalls sleeping in a basement next to a saloon requires a kind of recalibration. The books are warm, the books are wholesome. The books smell of baked bread and pine wood. The Masters Hotel basement in the fall of 1876 smelled of dishwater, tallow candles, and other people's meals. It was not what anyone had hoped for, but hope by that point was not the operating currency. Survival was. The partnership arrangement with William Stedman was simple in structure, though not in practice. In exchange for room and board, the Ingalls family worked. Charles performed carpentry, general maintenance, and whatever other physical labour the hotel required. He also worked behind the bar, the man who had played his fiddle for his daughters on the open prairie, now pouring drinks for strangers late into the evening. Carolyn ran the kitchen. Every day, 7 days a week, she cooked for hotel guests and the steady stream of boarders who paid weekly for their meals. She managed the dining room. She kept the kitchen clean and the larder stocked. She supervised the hired girl who helped with laundry and heavier tasks. She did all of this while also caring for 3 young daughters in the same cramped basement space. And then there were Mary and Laura. Mary was 11. Laura was 9. They were old enough to be useful, and on the frontier in 1876, old enough to be useful was not a rhetorical phrase. It was a daily assignment. The girls cleaned rooms, they washed dishes, the endless, skin-reddening work of washing dishes for a hotel dining room, hot water, rough soap, stack after stack of plates from the breakfast rush, and then the dinner rush, and then the boarders' supper. They waited on tables, they swept, they carried. They did this while also going to school. That detail, Mary and Laura attending school in Burr, even while working in the hotel, is one of the quiet, stubborn acts of dignity buried in this story. Charles and Carolyn valued education the way people value things they never had enough of. Carolyn herself had trained as a teacher. Whatever else fell apart in Burr, the girls were going to school, so Mary and Laura got up in the morning, did their hotel chores, walked to the Burr school, came home, did more chores, and went to sleep in that basement room while the saloon next door did its business. This was their life. Not everything about Burr was grim. Even in the hardest chapters of a difficult story, there are people and moments that arrive sideways and make life bearable. In Burr, one of those people was a man named Benjamin Bisbee. And here is where this story does something that history almost never does. It gives you a villain who is also initially a genuine source of small pleasure. Benjamin Lee Bisbee had been born in New York in 1826 and had come to Winnesheek County, Iowa around 1851, one of the early settlers, the kind who arrived before the rush and stayed after it. By 1876 he was one of the wealthiest men in Burr. He owned property, he invested. He had the particular air of a man who had converted frontier opportunity into comfortable security at a time when most of his neighbours were converting opportunity into debt. Bisbee was also a singing teacher. He boarded at the Masters Hotel and paid his bills reliably, which made him, in Carolyn's words as relayed through Laura's memoir, our best-paying steady boarder. He must be pleased, if possible. That was the calculation. That was the arithmetic of survival. And so, because Bisbee was the best-paying boarder and Bisbee enjoyed music, Bisbee gave Laura singing lessons. Laura's own assessment of this arrangement, written with the dry precision of someone who had grown into a very honest adult, is worth hearing. I would rather play. She was 9 years old, with the entire outdoors waiting on the other side of the hotel door. She did not particularly want singing lessons. But Bisbee was the most reliable income in the building, and so Laura sat and sang, and Bisbee was pleased, and the bills were slightly less catastrophic than they might otherwise have been. This is how a childhood bends itself around the economic needs of a family in crisis. You learn to do the things that keep the money coming. You learn this very young. Then came February of 1877, and the fire. The saloon next door caught fire in the night. The town turned out, the way small towns did in an era before fire departments, before organised responses, before anything except neighbours and buckets, and the hope that the wind was not blowing the wrong direction. A bucket brigade formed in the cold winter air, passing pails of water from Silver Creek behind the hotel up to the blaze. One of the men in that bucket brigade was Benjamin Bisbee, and at some point in the chaos someone handed Bisbee a bucket that happened to have a hole in it. Bisbee pumped and passed, dutifully operating his end of the brigade for a considerable stretch of time, before anyone noticed that not a single drop of water from his section of the line was actually reaching the fire. The bucket was simply emptying itself onto the frozen ground as it went. Laura recorded this with what you can only describe as restrained glee. The fire was eventually brought under control. The saloon survived. The hotel survived. No one was seriously hurt. And Burr Oak had, for one night at least, the story of the richest man in town faithfully pumping water through a leaking bucket in the dark. You can almost hear the girls laughing about it in that basement room, under their quilts, after the fire was out and the grown-ups had gone back to their worrying. Even in the hardest years, children find the things worth laughing at. This is one of the things that keeps families alive when the economics are trying to break them. But the laughter never lasted long, and the economics always came back. The hotel partnership with William Stedman began to unravel before the winter was out. Charles felt with increasing certainty that the labour his family was providing, Caroline's kitchen work, his own carpentry and maintenance, the girls' daily service, was worth considerably more than what the Stedmans were paying in return. Room and board was not wages. It was barely survival. It gave the family a place to sleep and enough to eat, but it left no margin at all, no savings, no buffer against the next crisis. And on the frontier in 1876, the next crisis was never far away. There was also the town itself to contend with. Burr Oak, by 1876, was a place that had been bypassed. The railroads that were reshaping Iowa had chosen different routes. The traffic that once sustained 2 hotels and a cluster of saloons now moved on steel rails through towns that were not Burr Oak. The hotel struggled to fill its rooms. Travellers who might once have stopped for the night now did not stop at all. The revenue that was supposed to make the partnership workable simply was not there in sufficient quantity. The breaking point came sometime in the winter of 1876 into 1877. The exact moment is not recorded, which is itself a kind of record. The things that fall apart quietly rarely have a documented date. There was no formal dissolution, no legal proceeding, no moment anyone circled on a calendar. There was just, gradually, Charles Ingalls working less at the hotel and more elsewhere. He found work at the grist mill near Burr Oak, grinding grain. Honest physical work that paid actual wages rather than subsistence. But gristmill work was seasonal and intermittent, dependent on what farmers brought in to be ground, and in 1876 and 1877 the farmers of northeastern Iowa had their own financial troubles. So Charles took other work. Laura writes in Pioneer Girl that her father took employment that kept him away from home a great part of the time. She does not specify exactly what this work was. Historians who have studied the period believe it was likely itinerant labour. the kind of short-term, cash-paying work that desperate men took in the Depression years of the late 1870s, hauling, construction, whatever could be found and grabbed before the next man got there first. The phrase "kept him away from home a great part of the time" is one of the saddest sentences in Laura's memoir. Think about what that means. The part of the Little House books is defined by his presence. He is the fiddle at night, the stories at supper, the strong arms that carry you to bed when you have fallen asleep in the wagon. He is there, always there, the gravitational centre of every story Laura would eventually write. In Burr Oak, in the winter and spring of 1877, Pa was frequently not there, and in the space his absence created, Caroline managed. She always managed. She found them new lodgings, rooms above a grocery store on the main street of Burr Oak, when the hotel arrangement finally ended. The new rooms were close to the Saloon district, which was not an improvement by any measure Caroline Ingalls recognised as improvement. She worried about the children's safety. She said so. The record preserves her worry even if it doesn't preserve her exact words. But the grocery store rooms were what they could afford, and what they could afford was becoming its own kind of sentence, an answer to every question that only ever had one possible conclusion. What school should the girls attend? The one they could reach on foot? What food would they eat? What the grocery store extended credit for? Who would they be in this town? The family in the rooms above the store next to the saloon, whose father came home less and less often, whose mother's face was getting tired around the eyes in the particular way that exhausted, worried, grieving women get tired. Or the way that children notice long before they have words for it. Laura noticed. She wrote later that she knew her parents were troubled, that she could feel the weight of it in the house, in the pauses between words, in the music her father played on the evenings he was home. Because when Pa did come home, he played his fiddle. And the music had changed. Laura's description of this is one of the most quietly devastating details in all of Pioneer Girl. She writes that her father played sort of lonesome, longing music in the evenings, not the bright, quick dance tunes he had played on the prairie, not the songs that made you want to move your feet and forget the cold. Something slower. Something that reached into a room and described, without words, the exact feeling of a man who is trying very hard to hold his family together and is not entirely sure he will succeed. You have heard music like that. Everyone has. The kind of music that is honest in a way that language is not allowed to be. The kind of music a man plays when he cannot say out loud what he's afraid of. Laura was 9, then 10, listening to her father play lonesome music in a room above a grocery store in a small declining Iowa town, while the saloon made its noise downstairs and her mother sat sewing in the lamplight with the careful stillness of someone who has decided that stillness is the only thing left within her control. This was the family that had once stood on an open Minnesota prairie with 200 acres of wheat growing toward the sky. And somewhere, in the year between that field and this room, they had become something else entirely. Something more brittle. Something that could still hold, but only just. The debts were building. The money was not. And somewhere across town, a woman was about to have an idea. The idea was about Laura. And it was the kind of idea that, once spoken out loud, changed everything in the house at once, the way certain words do when they name, for the first time, the exact fear a family has been carrying in silence. In Chapter 3, we sit in the room when Mrs. Eunice Starr comes to call. There are certain moments in a family's life that arrive dressed as kindness. They come to the door with a pleasant face and a soft voice and a reasonable explanation. They use words like opportunity and comfort and help, and if you're tired enough, if you have been tired long enough, you might almost mistake them for exactly what they say they are. Caroline Ingalls was not that tired, but the moment was coming. And before we get there, you need to understand exactly what kind of spring it was in Burr Oak, Iowa, in 1877, and why the Ingalls family had moved, yet again, from one set of rented rooms into another, and why the debts were no longer just a worry you spoke about in hushed tones after the children were asleep. By spring of 1877, the debts were a presence in the house, the kind of presence that sits at the table with you. By the time the cold broke and the Iowa mud softened into spring, the Ingalls family had made one more small move within Burr Oak's narrow geography. From the rooms above the grocery store, they had shifted to a small red brick house at the edge of town. The house was rented from Benjamin Bisbee, the same Benjamin Bisbee who had once sat at the hotel dining table and paid reliably for his meals, the same man whose singing lessons Laura had endured with as much patience as a 10-year-old could manufacture. He was now their landlord. This is worth noting, because it tells you something about the particular texture of poverty in a small frontier town. It is not anonymous. It is not distant. In a town the size of Burr Oak, the man who once tipped generously for his breakfast is the same man who now holds the deed to the roof above your children's heads. The economic relationships are intimate. Everyone knows everyone's business. And everyone, by now, knew the Ingalls family's business very well. The red brick house was small, but it was a house, an actual house, not a hotel basement, not a room above a shop. It had walls that belonged to its own four corners. It had a yard where the children could go outside without walking into a saloon shadow. And into this small house, on the 23rd of May, 1877, came Grace Pearl Ingalls, the fifth child, a girl again, small and squalling and entirely new to the world's troubles, which was perhaps the only mercy in the timing of her arrival. Grace did not know about the debts. She did not know that the doctor who attended her birth would add his fees to the list of what the family owed. She did not know that the grocery store up the road had extended credit that was running out of patience, or that the rent on this small brick house was already falling behind. She did not know any of it. She was a baby, warm and alive and wrapped in whatever cloth Caroline could spare. She was, in the middle of everything that was falling apart, a piece of something whole. Caroline had now given birth to 5 children. She had buried one of them on a stranger's farm in Minnesota 9 months before. She had cooked and cleaned and worked through a winter in a hotel basement and a spring in rented rooms. She was 37 years old, which on the frontier in 1877 was not the youth it might sound like. It was a 37 earned slowly, through hard seasons and harder miles, through the kind of labour that ages a woman in her hands and around her eyes before it gets anywhere near her spine. She looked at her new daughter and she said nothing that the record has preserved. But you can imagine the arithmetic she was doing. 5 people to feed before Grace arrived. Now, 6. Charles's work still irregular, still the kind that kept him away more than it kept him home. The doctor's bill fresh and new, the rent behind, the grocery bill behind, the spring mud drying into summer dust outside the window of that little brick house, and somewhere in this town, a town she had never chosen, a town she had arrived at in grief and left her heart somewhere back in Minnesota's soil. A woman had been watching, had been noticing, had been forming an idea. Her name was Mrs. Eunice Starr. She was the wife of Burr Oak's doctor. In a town as small as Burr Oak, the doctor's household occupied a particular social position. Not wealthy by Eastern standards, not wealthy by any absolute measure, but wealthy by the measure of the frontier, which meant stable, which meant her debts were not the kind that kept her awake at night, which meant she had a house large enough to need tending and could observe other households with the detached perspective that comfort provides. Mrs. Starr had observed the Ingalls household. What she saw was not difficult to read. A mother with a newborn and 3 other daughters. A father absent more days than he was present. A family that had moved 3 times within the same small town in less than a year. A family whose children were clean and educated and well raised, which told you something about the mother's character, even as it told you nothing reassuring about the finances. And she came to the door. Laura wrote down what happened next in Pioneer Girl, the private memoir she sealed away for 60 years and never allowed to become a children's story. Her words are plain. They carry no drama because they do not need any. The plainness is the drama. Mrs. Starr, she wrote, wanted me to go and live with her. She would adopt me and treat me just like her own. Let that sentence breathe for a moment. Wanted me to go and live with her. Would adopt me and treat me just like her own. There is a version of this sentence that sounds like generosity. A comfortable woman, childless or with children grown, offering a struggling family relief. One less mouth to feed, one more child properly housed and cared for. An act of community, of frontier solidarity, of the informal safety nets that small towns wove for their most desperate members. Well, that is one reading. Here is another. To understand the second reading, you need to know what the word adoption actually meant in the American frontier in 1877, not what it means today, with court orders and legal processes and rights and protections, what it meant then. In the 1870s, children from poor families were routinely bound out or placed out into the households of wealthier families. The language shifted depending on the arrangement. Sometimes it was called adoption, sometimes indenture, sometimes simply taking the child in. The legal distinctions between these categories were blurry and largely unenforceable. There were no child protective services. There were no adoption courts. There was a verbal agreement between adults and a child, and whatever happened next inside the walls of the wealthier household. What usually happened was work. Domestic work, primarily. The adopted girl, and it was almost always girls who were placed out into domestic service, because their labour was immediately useful in a household, would cook, clean, launder, tend younger children, carry water, black the stove, scrub the floors. She would do these things every day from early morning until the household was quiet at night. She would do them in exchange for her room and board. She would do them for years. She would not be paid, or if she were paid, the wages would go, legally and practically, to her family's debts, back to the doctor's bill, back to the grocer, back to the landlord, until the debt was cleared, and then perhaps beyond, because the reckoning of what was owed was always in the hands of the people who were owed it. This system had a name, or when historians write about it plainly, debt peonage, and Mrs. Starr's husband was the doctor. The doctor whose bill for delivering Grace Pearl Ingalls, for attending Caroline through her pregnancy, sat in a ledger somewhere in that comfortable house, under the family's name, adding its small but accumulating weight to everything else they owed. Biographer Caroline Fraser, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning study Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, interprets Mrs. Starr's offer precisely this way, as a coded proposal, the language of adoption providing the respectable surface, the domestic service and the debt repayment providing the actual structure underneath. Whether Mrs. Starr herself understood it in those exact terms is something history cannot confirm. People who benefit from systems do not always name the systems clearly, even to themselves. She may have believed she was offering Laura a better life. She may have believed she was doing a kind thing for a desperate family. Both of those things could be true, and the arrangement could still be what Fraser says it was. The road to peonage has always been paved with people who were quite sure they were helping. You need to understand what that offer felt like inside the walls of that little brick house. Laura was 10 years old by this point, born in February 1867, turned 10 just a few months before Grace arrived in May. Old enough to understand more than she was supposed to. Old enough to have already spent months watching her parents' faces for signs of how bad things were. And she wrote in Pioneer Girl with a clarity that carries across the decades like a bell struck once in a quiet room. I knew that Pa and Ma were troubled. She knew. Children always know. They do not always know the details, the specific numbers, the names of the creditors, the exact terms of the shortfall. But they know the weight of it. They know it from the pauses in conversation, from the way adults turn slightly away from each other when the money question comes up, from the meals that are slightly smaller, from the way a mother's hands stay busy even when there is nothing left to do with them. Laura had been reading the room for months, and now there was a woman at the door saying she wanted to take her away. There is no record of what Caroline said in response. Laura did not write it down, and Caroline left no diary, no letter, and nothing that captures this particular moment. The historical record gives us the offer and the refusal and the silence in between, and leaves the rest to you. But we know Caroline refused, firmly, completely, with the finality of a woman who had decided this question a long time before anyone was impolite enough to ask it out loud. Think about what it cost her to do that. Not the emotional cost, though that was real. The indignity of someone standing in your doorway suggesting your child would be better off elsewhere. Not just that. The practical cost Accepting the offer would have meant one less person to feed, one less set of clothes to mend and wash, one less child whose future pressed against you in the small hours of the night. It would have meant a reduction in the doctor's bill, one way or another. Or it would have meant one member of the family lifted temporarily out of the grinding arithmetic of the household's insufficiency. Caroline said no. She said no because in the 1870s, a woman who gave her child into domestic service in another household, even dressed as adoption, even presented as generosity, was understood to have failed. To have admitted what the family had been fighting, through every move and every accommodation, and every hour of unpaid hotel labour to deny that they could not manage, that they were beyond their own capacity to hold things together, that the frontier had beaten them in the most intimate way possible. Not just their crops, not just their finances, but their ability to keep their own children. There is also this. Caroline Ingalls was not a sentimental woman in the way the word is sometimes used to mean soft or impractical. She was precise and disciplined and not given to romanticising difficulty. But she held to certain things with an iron grip. Her family was one of them. Her children were one of them. You do not move from Wisconsin to Kansas to Wisconsin to Minnesota to Iowa, cooking meals and keeping house through every disaster the continent can throw at you in order to hand your daughter to a doctor's wife, not while you're breathing. And so the door closed. Mrs. Starr walked back across Burr Oak to her comfortable house. The doctor's bill remained on her husband's ledger. The Ingalls family remained in the little brick house that was not theirs, on a street in a town that had never felt like home, in a state they had come to in grief and were remaining in through stubbornness and a lack of better options. But something had shifted. The offer, once made, could not be unmade. It had named the thing the family had been refusing to name, that their poverty was now visible enough, serious enough, recognised enough by the town around them, that someone had felt comfortable suggesting a solution that involved separating the family. Laura wrote that after the offer, her father was restless, that he paced, that when he came home, the fiddle music in the evenings had a quality she could not quite describe, except as longing, as if the music was reaching for something it couldn't quite touch. You do not need Laura to explain what her father was longing for. It is the same thing every parent longs for when the ground beneath them stops being solid. Not wealth, not triumph, not vindication, just the ordinary, unremarkable dignity of being able to provide for the people in your house without the town noticing that you cannot. Charles Ingalls was 39 years old. He had been a farmer, a carpenter, a trader, a homesteader, a hotel worker, a mill hand, and a man who took work wherever it could be found and brought home whatever it paid. He had done all of this with the cheerful, indestructible optimism that his daughter would later build 8 books around. The pa, who always believed the next field, the next season, the next horizon, would be the one that finally worked out. That spring in Burr Oak, the optimism had a crack in it, and into that crack a decision was forming. Not yet fully formed, not yet spoken out loud between husband and wife, but there, the way important decisions are there before they are said, felt in the body before the mouth finds the words for them. Burr Oak was not going to get better. The railroad was not coming back through town. The hotel was not going to fill with paying travellers. The debts were not going to vanish. And now the town had offered to take his daughter in exchange for what he owed. The wagon was in the yard. The horses were, for now, for this moment, still in the barn. And somewhere to the west there was still a horizon that Charles Ingalls had not yet reached. That was enough. But there was one more obstacle between that decision and the open road. One more man who stood between the Ingalls family and their escape from Burr Oak. The same man who had once pumped water faithfully through a leaking bucket. The same man who had given Laura singing lessons she did not want. The same man who now held the overdue rent in one hand and a legal claim to their horses in the other. Benjamin Bisbee was not going to let them leave quietly. In Chapter 4, the night comes down and the wagon moves. Chapter 4, the man who owned the horses and the night that decided everything. Word target, approximately 3,000 words. All facts, verified against E.DOC. X. Phase 4, 0 repetition from chapters 1 to 3. USA female audience premium sleep retention tone. Seamless continuation from chapter 3 cliffhanger. Sometime in the night we children will wake to find the wagon with a cover on standing by the door. Laura Ingalls Wilder, Pioneer Girl, page 112. There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists in the hours between midnight and dawn. Not the quiet of peace, not the quiet of a house settling into sleep. This is the quiet of something being decided. The kind of quiet that gathers in the spaces between people who are moving very carefully, very deliberately, very much aware that the wrong sound at the wrong moment could change everything. That was the quiet in Burr, Iowa, on a summer night in 1877. Outside the small red brick house on the edge of town, the covered wagon was already standing by the door. Charles Ingalls had hitched the horses in the dark, slowly, without lantern light, without the sounds that usually came with the work of harnessing. The reins were in his hands. The road north stretched ahead of him, faint and pale in the darkness. Inside, Caroline was rousing the children. Mary, 12, Laura, 10, Carrie, 7, and Grace, barely 2 months old, born just that May, small enough to be carried in one arm and still light enough that you could hold her against your shoulder and feel her breathing and know, in the way only mothers know such things, that she was fine. She was here. She was safe. Come now. Quietly. Get in the wagon. No explanations. No time for questions. They climbed in. Pa put their bed in the wagon. The wagon moved. And Burr Oak, the town that had taken 13 months of their lives, their labour, their sun, their dignity, and their last reserves of hope, fell away behind them in the dark. This is the night Laura Ingalls Wilder remembered for the rest of her life and never once put into a book for children. And to understand why Charles Ingalls drove away in the middle of the night, why this gentle, optimistic, fiddle-playing man who would become one of the most beloved fictional fathers in American literature chose to flee his debts in darkness, you need to understand the man who made him do it. Benjamin Bisbee was not a villain in any dramatic sense. He was not cruel. He did not make speeches about the rights of the powerful over the poor. He didn't need to. He was, as Laura recorded in her memoir, simply one of the richest men in Burr Oak. And in a town as small and economically stunted as Burr Oak, that particular distinction carried the weight of a courthouse. You have met him before in this story, briefly. The man who pumped water faithfully through a bottomless bucket during the February hotel fire. The steadiest paying boarder at the Masters Hotel. The one whose singing lessons Laura endured with gritted patience, because his goodwill was worth something to a family that could not afford to offend the people who fed them. What you need to understand about Bisbee now is the shift in his relationship to the Ingalls family from boarder to landlord. A shift that changed the entire geometry of power between them. When the Ingalls family left the hotel and moved into the small red brick house at the edge of town for Grace's birth in May, that house belonged to Benjamin Bisbee. He owned it. He set the rent. He collected it, or he did not collect it, entirely at his own discretion. And in the summer of 1877 the rent had not been collected for some time. Charles had approached Bisbee and asked for an extension. He was not asking for charity. He was specific about this. He promised to send it to him in a little while. He had a plan, or the outline of a plan, to earn what was owed once the family was back on their feet somewhere else, somewhere with more work, somewhere that wasn't this railroad bypass town slowly dying of its own irrelevance. Bisbee said no. And then Bisbee did something that transformed the conversation from a business dispute into a survival crisis. He threatened to take the horses, not the furniture, not the household goods, not whatever small savings Charles may have had tucked away. The horses. He threatened the horses because he knew what horses meant to a frontier family in 1877, and he knew that Charles Ingalls knew what they meant. And he knew that this knowledge would land with the force that it was intended to land with. Charles called him a rich old skinflint. It was not a productive negotiation. If you have never lived in a world without engines, this requires some translation. The Ingalls family's horses were not a luxury. They were not a convenience. They were not comparable to a car you could replace by taking out a loan or calling a dealer. On the American frontier in the 1870s, a team of horses was the mechanism by which a family remained a family in any practical sense. Without horses, you could not travel. You could not haul goods. You could not plough a field if you found land to plough, or carry freight for hire if freight work presented itself, or get your children to the next town when the current town had nothing left to offer you. Without horses, you were not a family in motion. You were a family frozen in place, in a town that had already demonstrated across 13 months that it had nothing left to give you. Without horses, Charles had no way to earn wages beyond whatever casual labour he could find within walking distance of Burr Oak, which, in the summer of 1877, in a town the railroad had passed over, amounted to very nearly nothing. Without horses, the family could not return to Walnut Grove, or go anywhere at all. Without horses, Benjamin Bisbee's threat was not just a collection tactic. It was a sentence. Charles had sold the family's cow earlier that summer to generate travel money. A decision that was itself a kind of sacrifice, since a milk cow meant the difference between having dairy for a nursing infant and not having it. He had burned that resource. He had spent what was left of the disposable assets. The horses were what remained. The horses were the last lever by which the family could move themselves out of their own paralysis. Bisbee knew this. Whether Bisbee was a callous man, or simply a rational one, whether his refusal to extend credit was cruelty, or just the ordinary logic of a creditor protecting his property in a depression economy, where credit was thin and defaults were common, is a question history cannot fully answer. What history can answer is what his decision forced. It forced Charles Ingalls to choose. By the summer of 1877, Charles had been turning this problem over for weeks. You can hear it in the way Laura described him at night during those final Burr Oak months. The fiddle music that sounded different, sort of lonesome, longing music, as though the instrument was reaching for something the rest of the house had already given up on finding. He had 3 options. None of them were good. The first was to surrender Laura. Mrs. Starr's offer was still, presumably, on the table. A wealthy household, a doctor's roof, meals and clothing, and the end of one child's share of the family's burden. In exchange, Laura, gone. Laura in another woman's house, serving another family's needs, her labour flowing not toward the people who loved her, but toward the settlement of accounts that her father could not settle himself. Charles and Caroline had already answered this question. They had answered it without discussion, with the particular finality of parents who do not need to deliberate because some things are simply not subject to deliberation. Laura was not going anywhere. The second option was to stay in Burr Oak and surrender the horses legally, allow Bisbee to take them, satisfy the debt, and remain in Iowa with no means of departure and no viable path to economic recovery. This option was not, strictly speaking, a choice. It was a slow collapse dressed as accommodation. The third option was to leave before Bisbee could act, to leave under cover of the one thing that could shield them from seizure, the dark. This was not a dramatic decision in the way that dramatic decisions are sometimes described. A moment of clarity, a resolution reached with a sense of purpose and righteous determination. This was, as historian Pamela Smith Hill has written, a decision made by a man with no good options, choosing the one that would preserve the most of what mattered. It was the decision of a father. There are things we know about that night, and things we can only stand beside. We know the wagon was covered. Laura noted the canvas top as the first thing she saw when she was roused from sleep. This matters because a covered wagon meant a wagon prepared for travel, not just a quick errand. The canvas had been put up deliberately. This was planned. We know the horses were hitched in the dark, not at dawn, not at first light, not in the early grey of morning when a neighbour might look out and see a family loading their possessions and draw their own conclusions. In the night, in the quiet that exists between the hour when people have finally gone to sleep and the hour when the world begins to wake again. We know that Pa put their bed in the wagon. The bed, the physical object that more than any other in a frontier household represented home, warmth, the place where the sick were tended and the children slept, and the married lay down at the end of the day and said whatever they needed to say to each other about the state of things. The bed was the last thing, probably. Everything else went in, and then the bed, and then the children climbed in around it. We know Caroline had Grace in her arms. We know they drove away in the darkness. What we do not know, what the record does not give us and what it would be dishonest to invent, is what the children understood. Mary was 12, that old enough to have pieced most of it together from weeks of overheard conversations and the particular silence that parents put between themselves when they are discussing something they do not want their children to hear. Laura was 10 and had already written in her memoir that she knew that Pa and Ma were troubled. Carrie was 7, young enough perhaps to have understood only that they were moving again, that the wagon was familiar ground, that wherever it went the family went with it. And Grace was 2 months old. She understood nothing except warmth. Here is the part of this story that Laura Ingalls Wilder could not put in a children's book. Charles Ingalls was not fleeing an injustice. He was not escaping persecution or tyranny or the malice of a government or the cruelty of a system acting against him in bad faith. He was, by every legal and conventional standard of 1877, skipping out on a debt he owed to a man who had a legal right to collect it. The rent was real. The debt was real. Bisbee's right to the horses, had he gotten to them in time, was real. Charles was not a villain, but he was not, on that particular night on that particular road, unambiguously heroic in the way that the Pa of the Little House books is always unambiguously heroic. He was something more complicated and more human than that. A fundamentally decent man, a devoted father, a person who had spent 13 months trying every legitimate option available to him, and who had arrived at the place where the legitimate options were gone. Historian Pamela Smith Hill, writing in 2021, put it plainly. What choice did Charles Ingalls have? His wages in Burr Oak didn't cover his family's living expenses, his landlord wouldn't agree to an extension on the rent, and if the Ingalls family lingered, they'd lose their team of horses, and still face the prospect of homelessness in the future. She went on to say something that carries even more weight. I think it's time to give Charles Ingalls the benefit of the doubt. He shouldn't be condemned for the decision he made in Burr Oak. Instead, we should view him as an example of resilience, a dedicated father desperate to hold his family together during extraordinarily hard times. There's nothing dishonourable in that. This reframing matters, not as exoneration, because no exoneration is needed, but as correction. For generations, and readers who knew Pa only from the Little House books knew a man who was steady and capable and optimistic, a man whose failures were always temporary and whose character was always beyond question. The Burr Oak night does not destroy that man. It makes him real. It puts him in the category of human beings rather than the category of symbols. He chose his children over his creditors. He chose his horses, which were his children's future, over his landlord's present claim. He chose the road over the debt, and then he drove north in the dark, with his wife beside him and his daughters asleep in the bed behind him, and the town of Burr Oak fell away into the Iowa summer night, and he did not look back. The wagon rolled north. Burr Oak sits in Winneshiek County, Iowa, barely 3 miles from the Minnesota border. The road to Walnut Grove was not a long one in miles, though on a frontier track in the dark with a nursing infant and 3 sleeping children, miles mean something different than they do on a paved highway. They moved slowly, they moved carefully, they moved like people who had made a decision and were living inside it now and had nothing left to do but keep going. Walnut Grove, Minnesota. The place they had left the previous summer, with 2 harvests destroyed, and a farm lost to debt, and a baby boy who had not survived the journey south. The place they had retreated from in apparent defeat, carrying nothing but the wagon and the horses and the remnants of a family that had, in the space of a few months, buried one of its own and sold everything that wouldn't fit in a covered wagon. They were going back. This is the part of the story that doesn't fit neatly into the mythology of the frontier as a place of forward motion, of horizons always new, of the west always beckoning. The Ingalls weren't heading west. They were heading back to the people who knew them, back to the community that, whatever its limitations, was their community. Friends in Walnut Grove took them in, read that sentence again and feel what it means for a family arriving with no money, no house, outstanding debts in the state they had just fled, a newborn, and whatever pride had survived the previous 13 months. Friends took them in, which means there were people in Walnut Grove who looked at Charles Ingalls and his wife and his children and saw not debtors or failures or cautionary tales, but neighbours, people worth helping, people whose difficulties were understood to be the result of forces larger than any one family's capacity to resist. Charles found work in a store, not farming, not the outdoor labour that had defined his self-conception for most of his adult life. Store work, indoors, behind a counter, the work of a man who is rebuilding from a position of less than nothing and is not in a position to be particular about what form the rebuilding takes. And then, in 1879, 2 years after the midnight flight from Burr, 2 years after the debt left unpaid and the horses saved in the dark, Charles Ingalls was elected Justice of the Peace for Walnut Grove, Minnesota. He had stood in front of his neighbours, his creditors, anyone who might have heard what happened in Iowa, and they had given him a public office. This is not a small thing. Yet it means that whatever the Burr Oak night had cost him, in reputation, in the internal economy of his own self-regard, in the gap between the man he wanted to be and the man circumstances had made him, it had not cost him his community's fundamental trust. It means that the people who knew him best, who had watched him struggle and fail and struggle again across years of agricultural catastrophe and economic depression and infant death, and the thousand small humiliations that grinding poverty inflicts, had looked at all of that and elected him anyway, because they understood, not because the debt didn't matter, but because they lived in the same world he did, under the same sky, in the same economy, facing the same forces. Because in a world where the locusts came and the banks failed and the railroad bypassed your town and the creditors threatened your horses, the people who fled were not always the villains of the story. Sometimes they were just the ones who got out. The wagon eventually came to rest. Burr Oak, Iowa grew quieter with each passing year. The railroad that had bypassed it sealed its fate as a town, and its population dwindled as the years moved away from the 1870s into the 1880s and beyond. Benjamin Bisbee remained there with his property and his ledgers. Mrs. Starr remained with her house and her offer that had been refused. The Masters Hotel stood on its original ground, and somewhere in that hotel's basement, in a single low-ceilinged room that 5 people had shared through a winter and a fall and a spring of desperate labour, the fingerprints of a family slowly faded, the marks of children's hands on the walls, the memory of fiddle music heard through floorboards, the ghost of a baby who had passed through this story without living long enough to have a memory of his own. The Ingalls family would go on to Dakota Territory. They would face harder winters than Iowa had given them. They would endure the hard winter of 1880 to 1881, which would kill the town of De Smet's food supply and come close to killing its people. They would survive that too. And Laura would grow up and marry and lose her own baby son and survive her own disasters on her own frontier and eventually sit down in a Missouri farmhouse with a pencil and tablet and try to get all of it onto paper before it slipped away. She wrote about Burr Oak. She wrote about Freddie. She wrote about the hotel basement and the saloon fire and the singing lessons she hadn't wanted, and the adoption offer that had been refused and the night they woke to find the covered wagon standing at the door. She wrote it all down in the private memoir she called Pioneer Girl, the 74,000-word accounting of her life that she intended for adult eyes and adult understanding. And then she did not put any of it into the children's books. The Little House series skips directly from the grasshopper plagues of Plum Creek to the family's arrival in Dakota Territory, the Iowa year, those 13 months in Burr Oak, the midnight flight, the debt, the horses, the death of Freddie, the birth of Grace. The woman who came to the door simply does not exist in the world of the published books. Between on the banks of Plum Creek and by the shores of Silver Lake, Burr Oak disappeared. The Ingalls family appeared to have stepped smoothly from one difficulty to the next, with no missing year, no dead son, no debt, no darkness, no night on the road north with a covered wagon, and a family wrapped in silence. Generations of readers, millions of them across decades, understood Laura's childhood through those books, and had no reason to suspect that the map they were reading had a region deliberately left blank. It took until 2014 for the full Pioneer Girl manuscript to reach print. It took until 2017 for Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires to give the Burr Oak Year the scholarly examination it deserved. And it took the better part of a century for the story of the night Charles Ingalls loaded his family into a covered wagon in the dark and drove away from his debts to become part of the public record. But the night itself happened. The debt was real. The horses were real. The children were real. The road north was real. And the woman who wrote those beloved books, who gave the world Paya's Fiddle and Ma's China Shepherdess, and the long grass bending on the Kansas prairie, she was real too. Not the simplified, sunlit figure of the mythology, but a woman who'd been 10 years old on a dark road in Iowa, half asleep in a wagon bed beside her sisters, while her father drove away from the place that had tried to take her. She remembered. She wrote it down. She chose, for reasons that were her own, not to pass it on to the children who would have been reading by lamplight or bedside lamp or the glow of a flashlight under a quilt. But she knew, and now, finally, so do we. There is still one question this story has not answered. Not what happened in Burr Oak, and not why Charles and Caroline made the choices they made. The deeper question, the one that sits at the heart of everything, is why Laura Ingalls Wilder, when she finally sat down to write her childhood in full as an adult, included the Burr Oak Year in her private pages, and then cut it entirely from the books that made her famous. In Chapter 5, we go to Rocky Ridge Farm in Missouri, 1930. So there's woman at the pencil, the tablet in her hand, and the deliberate architecture of what she chose to remember and what she chose to erase. There is a particular kind of memory that does not fade. Not the sharp ones, the moments of sudden shock or bright joy that print themselves permanently into the body and come back fully formed decades later, at a smell, a sound, the quality of light on an afternoon. Not those. This is a different kind, the ones that exist not as moments, but as a weight you carry so long that you stop noticing it. The way chronic grief becomes part of the furniture of your interior life. The way a year of sustained shame or fear gets folded into the structure of who you are until you can no longer separate it from yourself. You can only choose, when the time comes to speak, whether to mention it. Laura Ingalls. Wilder chose not to mention it. Not to the millions of children who would read her books by lamplight and flashlight, and the warm glow of a bedroom nightlight for generations. Not to the librarians who championed her work. Not to the reporters who asked her, over and over, to describe her extraordinary childhood. Not in any of the letters she wrote to her readers, which numbered in the thousands over the decades she was publishing. She buried Burr Oak so completely and so deliberately that the general public did not know it had happened until 2014, 84 years after she had written it all down in a private manuscript she called Pioneer Girl, and 57 years after her own death. That is not forgetting. That is architecture. Deliberate, considered, load-bearing architecture. The kind that requires real engineering. Because what you leave out of a structure shapes its form just as much as what you put in. This chapter is about that architecture, about why she built the story the way she did, about what the walls were hiding, and about what it costs, then and now, to live inside a myth instead of a truth. If you grew up reading the Little House books, and if you are listening to this story, there is a very good chance you did, you came away with a specific feeling about what the frontier was. It was hard. The books were honest about that. The cold was real, the hunger was real, the work was relentless, never quite finished. Laura did not pretend that pioneer life was easy, but it was manageable. That was the implicit promise woven into every chapter, every season, every difficulty the family faced. The hardship was always the kind that a loving family, a resourceful mother, a capable father, and the right amount of determination could get through. They would be cold, but not frozen, hungry, but not starving, frightened, but not broken. That feeling, that the difficulty had limits, that there was always a floor beneath the Ingalls family that would hold them, was not an accident. It was a choice. And the clearest evidence of that choice is the year that doesn't appear in any of the books. The year that fell between On the Banks of Plum Creek and By the Shores of Silver Lake, with no acknowledgement, no transition, no explanation. The year the family was in Iowa, working in a hotel for room and board, moving from one set of rented rooms to another, watching their debts accumulate past any reasonable hope of repayment. The year someone came to the door and offered to take Laura away. In the published books, the Ingalls family goes from Minnesota grasshopper country to Dakota territory, as though crossing a state line was simply the next natural step in a journey with a clear destination. In Pioneer Girl, the private manuscript, you can see the Iowa year in full. Freddie's death, the hotel basement, the rooms above the grocery store, Mrs. Starr's offer, the midnight departure, the return to Walnut Grove with nothing. Laura wrote it, every word, and then, when she turned her memories into books for children, she removed it as if it had never been. Scholars who have studied the gap between Pioneer Girl and the Little House books generally offer several explanations for why Burr disappeared, and all of them contain truth. The first is the question of the audience. The books were written for children, and children's books in the 1930s operated within specific emotional boundaries. There was a limit to how much darkness a children's narrative was expected to hold, and the Burr year, with its dead infant, its threatened child indenture, and its debt-fleeing midnight flight, pushed well past that limit. A story in which a family's poverty becomes so visible that a neighbour feels comfortable suggesting they give away a child is not a story that fits between two covers with an apple tree on the jacket. The second explanation is ideological. The Little House books were written and published between 1932 and 1943, in the depths and aftermath of the Great Depression, a decade when the country was in desperate need of a certain kind of story. Not a story about families destroyed by economic forces beyond their control. Not a story about how debt could follow you across state lines, and how the most capable, loving father could still end up owing money he could not repay, and fleeing in the night. America needed a story about surviving, about making do with less and finding it enough, about a family that held together through everything the frontier could throw at it, and came out the other side intact. The Little House books provided exactly that story, and they provided it at exactly the moment the country needed to hear it. The Burr year could not be part of that story, not because it was false, it was absolutely true, but because it undermined the very machinery the story depended on to function. It turned Pa from a restless but ultimately triumphant pioneer into a man who sometimes ran out of road. It made visible the structural economic forces, debt, depression, locust plagues, a national financial system that crushed working families, that the pioneer mythology required to stay invisible. But the third explanation is the one that sits beneath the other two, and it is the most human. It was her family, not an abstraction, not the pioneer family as a cultural unit. Her family. Her father, who played the fiddle in the evenings and whose restlessness she had loved since she was old enough to understand it. Her mother, who had refused to let anyone take her daughter, and whose standards of domestic dignity had held somehow through every basement and saloon and rented room. Her brother Freddie, who had not survived the journey to the place the Burr year was supposed to save them. To write Burr into the children's books would have been to publish her father's debt and her family's flight to an audience of millions. To put into permanent, accessible, widely circulated print the thing Charles Ingalls had spent the rest of his life quietly not mentioning. The year he had to drive away in the dark because he could not pay his rent. Charles Ingalls died in 1902. He never saw his daughter become a famous author. He never read a word she wrote about their family. By the time the Little House books were being shaped for publication in the 1930s, he had been gone for 30 years. But Laura remembered who he was, and she made a choice about what version of him the world would know. There is a pattern running through the published Little House books that becomes visible once you know what to look for. It is not dishonesty exactly. It is something more precise than that. It is the deliberate calibration of how much truth to reveal. Take the Kansas book, Little House on the Prairie. In it, the family builds a house on the prairie, makes a home, and then leaves because the government is about to force white settlers off native land. It reads as an external disruption, bad timing, bad luck, forces beyond their control sending them back the way they came. What the book does not emphasise is that the Ingalls family had settled on Osage land illegally in the first place, that Charles knew this when he filed his claim, and that when they left, they lost everything they had invested in a gamble they had entered knowingly. That is not just bad luck, that is a failed bet with consequences. Take Minnesota, on the banks of Plum Creek. The grasshopper plague is there, and it is vivid and frightening. But the book suggests a recovery that the historical record does not quite support. The family did not simply get through the grasshopper years and move on. They were left so deeply in debt, with so little capacity for repayment, that the Iowa year was the direct result, a forced migration to wage labour because the agricultural economy had beaten them flat and left them with nothing to farm. The book shows you the storm. It does not show you the full depth of the flooding that came after. And then there is the deepest omission, what chronic poverty actually does to a family over time. It is not just hunger or cold, both of which the books do show, honestly and without sentimentality. It is the psychological weight of it, the way children learn, earlier than they should, to read the tension in a parent's shoulders, the way they start monitoring the meals for signs of how things stand, the way they dress for school knowing their clothes announce their family's standing to every other child in the classroom. Laura captured some of this in Pioneer Girl, when she wrote that she knew that Pa and Ma were troubled, a sentence that carries the weight of months, maybe years, of exactly this kind of vigilant, anxious watching. That sentence appears in Pioneer Girl. It does not appear in any of the published books, because acknowledging it fully, the psychological toll, the exhaustion, the cumulative damage of years of economic precarity, would have broken the most important implicit promise the Little House books make to their readers, that the family was going to be okay, that the floor was there, that love and hard work and the right kind of optimism were enough. Sometimes they were not enough. Laura knew this from the inside, and she chose, carefully and deliberately, to protect her readers from knowing it the same way. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old, and she wrote Pioneer Girl as a complete honest account of her childhood, including Burr Oak, including Freddie, including the midnight flight. She wrote it in pencil on cheap-lined tablets, in the same careful script she had used her whole writing life. And she wrote it with the candour of a woman who did not at that point expect the account to become a children's series. She was writing for herself, and for adult readers who could handle the full weight of what she was describing. But as the books took shape, as Little House in the Big Woods became a series, and the series became a cultural institution, and the cultural institution became the primary way millions of Americans understood the frontier, the Pioneer Girl manuscript stayed in a drawer, unpublished, not offered to editors, not shown to the children who wrote fan letters asking what happened next, just held, privately, in the possession of the family. It was published in 2014 by the South Dakota Historical Society Press, edited by Pamela Smith Hill, 84 years after Laura finished writing it. Think about what that span of time contains. 2 world wars, the full arc of the Great Depression and its aftermath. The post-war prosperity that made the Little House books even more nostalgically resonant, as the America that had created them became economically unrecognizable. The television adaptation in the 1970s that gave the story a second life, and introduced it to a generation of viewers who had not read the books. And through all of it, the Burr Oak year sitting in a private archive, unknown to the general reading public, its existence unsuspected by anyone who had not done very specific archival research. That silence shaped what Americans understood about poverty on the frontier. It is not a small thing to say that. Generations of readers, many of them women, and many of them girls who'd grown up reading about Laura and carrying her story as a kind of template for what strength and resilience looked like, understood the frontier through books that had been edited to remove their darkest year. They understood making do as a choice, a philosophy, a form of dignified resourcefulness, rather than as a survival response to conditions that were genuinely out of a family's control. They understood Charles Ingalls as a man of optimism and capability, not as a man who had, at one specific point in his life, driven away from a debt in the middle of the night to keep his horses. Both of those things were true, but only one of them was in the books. There is one more person in this story who deserves to be seen before we leave it. Grace Pearl Ingalls, born May 23rd, 1877, in the small red brick house in Burr Oak, during the most desperate stretch of her family's financial collapse. The baby who arrived while the debts were piling up, and the doctor's wife was forming an idea about what to do with Laura, and the midnight wagon was still weeks away from being loaded. Grace grew up and made a life. She married a South Dakota man named Nathan Dow in 1901, and they farmed together in the Dakota Plains. And then, in the 1920s, the agricultural economy collapsed again, as it periodically did, as it had done to her family in 1873, in the same pattern of boom and bust that had taken everything from her parents, before she was old enough to know she'd been born into the middle of it. Grace and Nathan lost their farm. She spent her later years in financial insecurity and declining health. Her circumstances in old age not dramatically different from the circumstances into which she had been born 70-some years earlier. The frontier had promised opportunity, and it had delivered for a time the ordinary difficult satisfactions of farm life. And then it had taken those away too, in the same way and through the same forces that had made her birth, in May 1877, an event more weighted with anxiety than celebration. Scholars note Grace's trajectory not to argue that destiny is inescapable, but because it is honest. The pioneer myth suggested that the hard times were temporary, that the land could be made to yield, that if you worked hard enough and long enough, the frontier would eventually reward your persistence. For many families, for Charles and Caroline's youngest daughter, born in the depths of their worst year, it did not work out that way. The frontier gave Grace a life. It did not give her security. It did not ultimately give her the floor that the Little House books always promised would hold. Her story is not in any of the books. The Little House books are not diminished by the truth about what they left out. That needs to be said plainly, because the alternative, treating the omissions as a kind of betrayal, misunderstands what a myth is for and what it costs to build one. Laura did not set out to deceive anyone. She set out to make a true thing about love and family and the particular courage it takes to keep going when the ground keeps disappearing under you. And she made it the only way she could, which was by shaping and selecting and choosing what to leave in and what to leave out. Every story does this. Every memoir does this. Every person who has ever sat down to write about their own life has made exactly these decisions. What to include, what to soften, what to protect. What makes Laura's case different is scale. The story she built became so foundational, so deeply embedded in how a country understood its own origin, that the gaps inside it became gaps in the national imagination. Not just one woman's privacy, but an entire cultural account of what poverty looked like, what failure looked like, what it meant to be a working-class family on the American frontier trying to make something out of nothing. Reading the Little House books now, reading them with the knowledge of what they were built on and what they were built to conceal, does not mean reading them with contempt. It means reading them with the complexity they deserve. Hearing the fiddle music and knowing it was also sometimes lonesome and longing. Seeing the little house and knowing it was sometimes a hotel basement. Watching Pa drive the wagon and knowing that once, on a summer night in Iowa, he drove it in the dark without a lamp as quietly as he could, because staying was no longer possible and the only way forward was away. The little girl in the back of that wagon, half asleep, not entirely sure what was happening, certain only that the family was together and moving, grew up to write 8 books that never once mentioned this night. She knew what she was doing. She knew because she had already written it down privately and honestly in pencil on cheap-lined paper, for herself and for the people she trusted with the full weight of the truth. And in those private pages, she left us the key to understanding everything the public pages were designed to make beautiful instead of bare. Next, Chapter 6. The world the Masters Hotel built in Burr Oak's quiet decline. and what it means that the only childhood home of Laura Ingalls Wilder still standing on its original site is the one she tried hardest to forget. There is something quietly extraordinary about a building that survives. Not a monument, not a mansion, not a courthouse or a cathedral built to outlast every human who walked through its doors. Just a 1.5-story wood frame building with a raised full basement, built in 1856, that has stood through every season of every year since. Through the Civil War, through the railroad age that bypassed it, and left its town stranded, through 2 world wars, through the long decline of small Midwestern farming communities, through decades of neglect and decades of restoration. It is called the Master's Hotel, or the Burr Oak House, depending on which era you are reading about. Most people have never heard of it, but anyone who has ever loved the Little House books, who has ever carried Laura Ingalls Wilder's childhood like a kind of compass, a story that told you something true about what it meant to be tough and small and determined in a large, indifferent world, should know this building's name, because it holds the single most important physical fact about everything those books were built on top of. It is the only childhood home of Laura Ingalls Wilder that still stands on its original site. Every other place the Ingalls family lived, the Big Woods cabin in Wisconsin, the dugout on Plum Creek in Minnesota, the claim shanty in Dakota Territory, is gone. The land remains, but the structures are gone, marked by interpretive signs or museum reconstructions built where the original buildings once stood, approximations of what was there. You can visit the sites. You cannot stand in the rooms. In Burr Oak, Iowa, you can stand in the room. The basement room where 5 people lived for months after burying a baby and arriving in a strange town with nothing is still there. The walls are still there. The floor is still there. The kitchen where Caroline Ingalls cooked for hotel boarders, managing her grief and her hunger and her children and her labour all at once, can still be walked through. And here is the quiet, irreducible irony at the centre of this entire story. The one home that Laura Ingalls Wilder tried hardest to erase from the record is the one that physically refused to disappear. When the covered wagon rolled out of Burr Oak in the summer of 1877, quietly, in the night, without notice or ceremony, it left behind a town that was already struggling with its own form of slow decline. Burr Oak sat in Winneshiek County, in the northeastern corner of Iowa, about 3 miles south of the Minnesota border. In the years immediately following the Civil War, it had been a plausible place to build a future. The land around it was fertile. The town had hotels and mills and the modest commercial infrastructure of a frontier community that believed the railroad was coming, that growth was the natural direction of things, that the next decade would look bigger and busier than the last. The railroad did not come. This was not unusual. It happened to dozens of small Midwestern towns in this era. Towns that had been founded on the premise that the iron rails would eventually find them, only to watch the lines curve 10 or 20 miles away toward more profitable routes, bypassing entire communities the way a river bypasses a dry channel. When the railroad chose its path, it chose the path of economic gravity, and the towns it skipped were left to reorient themselves around what they already had, which was, in most cases, not quite enough to sustain the ambitions that had built them. Burr Oak adjusted. It did not become a ghost town. People continued to live there, farm the surrounding land, send their children to school, bury their dead in the local cemetery. But the trajectory that the town's founders had imagined, the expansive railroad-connected commercial future, quietly closed off, and the community settled into the more modest shape that would define it for generations. The Master's Hotel continued operating after the Ingalls family left. William Stedman, who had purchased it in 1876 and invited Charles Ingalls to help run it, eventually moved on. The building passed through other hands, serving different purposes in different eras: hotel, boarding house, private residence, eventually a historical site. What it did not do, and through any of these transitions, was fall down. 3 stories of frame construction in a climate that punishes structures with freeze-thaw cycles, with hard winters and wet springs, with the gradual entropy that takes everything built by human hands and returns it to the ground. And still the building stood, still stands today. There is no great mystery to this in purely architectural terms. Old buildings survive when people choose to maintain them, when the community around them decides the structure is worth the work. What makes the Masters Hotel's survival remarkable is not the engineering, but the meaning. The fact that historians and preservationists eventually recognise what this building was, what had happened inside it, and chose to protect it precisely because of the story it held. In 1983, the Masters Hotel, the Burr House, was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That listing is a formal federal acknowledgement that a building or site possesses historical, architectural or cultural significance worthy of preservation. It does not force anyone to restore the building, does not prevent its owners from modifying it, but it places the site within the national record as something that matters, something that the country, officially, considers worth remembering. The reason given was Laura Ingalls Wilder's connection to the building. The year she spent there, the year she had worked so carefully to keep out of the public record for her entire writing life, was now officially the reason the building was considered nationally significant. Today the building operates as the Laura Ingalls Wilder Park and Museum, run by a non-profit preservation organisation in Burr. Visitors can walk through the rooms. They can see the dining area where Caroline cooked. They can walk the first floor where hotel guests once took their meals while the family worked around them. And they can go down to the basement, to the single room where the Ingalls family lived. All of them in one space for the first months of their time in Burr. It is a small room. That is perhaps the most visceral thing about standing in it. You can understand intellectually that frontier families lived in close quarters, that privacy was a luxury that economic security bought and economic precarity eliminated. You can understand this as a historical fact and carry it around in your head for years. And then you stand in the room, and the room is that size, and the understanding shifts from your head to your body, and it means something different than it did before. 5 people, in this room, grieving, working, uncertain about what came next, listening to the noise of the saloon somewhere above them after the work was finally done for the night. The basement room has been restored to approximate the conditions of 1876 to 1877. It is not a luxury restoration. It does not dress the past up in a way that makes it more comfortable than it was. The point of the restoration is accuracy, to give visitors a physical sense of what the space actually contained and what it actually felt like to inhabit. This kind of preservation is, in its way, an act of counter-narrative. The same counter-narrative that Pioneer Girl represented when Laura first wrote it in 1930. It insists that the difficult version of the story deserves to exist in the physical record, the same way Laura's private manuscript insisted that the difficult version deserved to exist on paper. Not the sanitized version, not the version shaped for a particular audience's comfort, but the version with the dimensions intact, the walls close, the circumstances legible. What is significant is that the building became a museum at all. There is no Little House Museum at the original Wisconsin site, because the original cabin is gone. There is a reconstructed homestead at Walnut Grove, and a museum in De Smet, South Dakota, and interpretive sites at other locations connected to the Little House series. But the only place where visitors walk through walls that actually existed during Laura Ingalls Wilder's childhood, the only place where the physical evidence is original, is the place she never mentioned in her books. The preservation chose Burr. The architecture chose Burr. The building itself, by simply refusing to come down, chose Burr as the place where the material truth of her childhood would be most directly accessible. There is one more detail about Burr that the outline preserves and that belongs in this final chapter, because it speaks to something specifically about what Laura absorbed during the year she lived there. The Burr Cemetery. Laura wrote in Pioneer Girl about walking through it, about reading the headstones, about the names and dates carved into the stone, and the brief records of lives that the frontier had claimed, children who had not survived, adults who had come west with ambitions and found instead an early grave. A 9-year-old girl, in the year after her baby brother died on the road to this town, walking among headstones and reading them. She did not interpret this for her readers in Pioneer Girl. She reported it with the same flatness she used for other observations. She went to the cemetery, she read the stones, she noticed the names. The emotional weight is not explained. It does not need to be. A child learning to read death as a landscape. A child who was already carrying her brother's name in a grave she could not visit because the river had taken the farm where he was buried. Walking the one cemetery in this unfamiliar town and reading the evidence that the frontier killed people, that the gap between arriving with hope and ending up in the ground was, for many, not very wide. This is context that shaped her. Not the public Laura, the author, the private Laura, the child, the one who grew up and wrote 8 books that were, at their core, about the distance between arriving somewhere and surviving it, about the odds, the cost, the fact that not everyone made it, and what it meant for the ones who did. She saw that in Burr Oak, in the cemetery, in the names on the stones. She carried it forward, in the way all serious writers carry what shaped them, not necessarily as something they write about directly, but as something that gives the work its gravity. It is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine one, asked by historians and scholars who study the gap between the frontier myth the Little House books built and the frontier reality the historical record reveals. Why does it matter, in the 21st century, that a family in 1876 Iowa ran from a debt in the middle of the night? Why does it matter that a little girl's poverty was visible enough to prompt a neighbour to suggest she be taken away? Why does it matter that the building where all of this happened is the only original structure still standing from her entire childhood? The answer is not nostalgic. It is not about warmth or comfort or the feeling of visiting a simpler time. The answer is structural. The economic forces that crushed the Ingalls family in 1876 and 1877, the convergence of a national financial collapse, a natural disaster that destroyed agricultural livelihoods, a credit system that gave frontier families just enough rope to hang themselves with, a labour economy that had no flaw. Those forces are not historical curiosities. They are the template. They describe, in their fundamental mechanics, the same dynamics that have driven housing insecurity, wage precarity, debt accumulation, and the particular psychological weight of visible poverty in every era since. What the Ingalls family experienced in Burr Oak is not a story from a different world. It is a story from the same world, with different surface details. A family that moved for economic reasons and arrived somewhere unfamiliar, took whatever work was available, fell behind on rent, found that their poverty was public in ways they could not control, and eventually had to leave before things got worse. This is not an 1870s story. This is a story that is happening in one form or another in cities and towns across America right now. The covered wagon has different shapes. The hotel basement has different walls. The landlord who threatens to take the horses has a different name and a different set of legal mechanisms. The underlying shape is the same, and the myth that surrounded that family, the myth that hard work and determination were always enough, that economic failure was a personal failing rather than a structural one, that self-reliance was both possible and sufficient, that myth did not die with the frontier. It survived, and was reinforced, and spread further through the very books that erased Burr Oak from their pages, and continues to shape how Americans think about poverty and debt, and the conditions under which people fall through the floor. Understanding Burr Oak is understanding the cost of that myth, not its comfort. The comfort is real. The books gave genuine sustenance to genuine readers in genuinely hard times. But the cost, the way the myth made invisible all the structural forces that made hardship not a character test, but a consequence, not a spiritual challenge, but an outcome. The way it told families that if they were struggling they needed to try harder, when what they actually needed was a railroad that came through their town, a financial system that didn't foreclose on their crops, a society that acknowledged that natural disasters and economic depressions were things that happened to people, not things people brought on themselves. The Ingalls family did not fail because Charles Ingalls lacked grit. He had extraordinary grit. He also had no money, no safety net, 2 consecutive ruined harvests, a depression that had collapsed the regional economy, and a newborn infant in a rented room with a creditor threatening to take his horses. Grit was not the variable that mattered. Late afternoon light falls differently on a building that is over 170 years old. You can stand across the street from the Masters Hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, and look at it in that light and know that the walls in front of you predate the Civil War, that they held the Stedman family and before them other families, and before that the travellers and businessmen of a frontier town that believed it was on its way to something larger, that in the fall of 1876, a covered wagon rolled up and a family climbed out, grieving and exhausted, and went in through the door because there was nowhere else to go. You can know that a little girl named Laura, who would grow up to write one of the most widely read children's series in American history, swept these floors and cleared these tables and listened through these walls to the noise of the saloon and the sound of her parents talking quietly about money they didn't have. You can know that she left this building and spent the rest of her life not writing about it. And you can know that the building didn't care. It stood through her silence. It stood through her fame. It stood through the decades when millions of children read her books and had no idea this place existed. When preservation workers and historians eventually came to document it, when the National Register nomination was written and submitted and accepted in 1983, when the museum was established and the basement room was restored and visitors began to come, the building received all of this with the same indifference that very old structures extend toward human events. It had been standing for 130 years by then. It had already outlasted everyone who had ever lived inside it. What it could not outlast was meaning, because once you know what happened inside it, once the Pioneer Girl manuscript was published in 2014, and the general public could read for the first time in detail what those 13 months in Iowa had looked like, the building became something that buildings rarely become: evidence. Not evidence in a courtroom sense, evidence in the deeper sense. Proof that the story happened. Proof that the basement room was real, that the family was real, that the poverty was real, that the debt and the fear and the midnight departure were not invented or exaggerated, but lived. Lived in this specific, physical, still-standing space. Every other site on the Little House Trail asks you to imagine the building that used to be there. In Burr Oak, you walk into the one that stayed. There is a particular kind of courage in keeping something, in deciding that a building, or a story, or a truth that someone spent decades trying to make disappear, deserves to remain in the world. The Ingalls family left Burr Oak with as little ceremony as they had arrived, in the dark, in a wagon, moving away from something rather than toward it, carrying their children and their grief and their determination and their debts, and the memory of a year that none of them, it seems, wanted to talk about again. The building they left behind did not follow them. It held the evidence of their presence the way old wood holds everything it has witnessed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The dimensions of the room, the layout of the kitchen, the stairs that led up to the saloon floor, the door through which they had carried everything they owned. Laura Ingalls Wilder lived to be 90 years old. She died in February 1957, 3 days after her birthday, at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. The farm she and Almanzo had built from rough Ozark land into 200 acres of orchard and pasture over the course of a lifetime. She died famous, beloved. Her name on a prestigious library award, her books in the hands of millions of readers around the world. She never mentioned Burr Oak publicly, not in interviews, not in correspondence with readers, not in the speeches she occasionally gave about her life and work. The building in northeastern Iowa and what it contained remained, for her entire public life, the one thing she had decided the world did not need to know. And yet, here we are, talking about it in the middle of the night, in the quiet with the lights low. Talking about it because the building is still there, and the manuscript is finally published, and the historians did their work, and the truth, the specific, particular, load-bearing truth that the myth was designed to replace, turned out to be more interesting than the myth, more human, more honest. They were more connected to what people are actually living through in any era, in any economic system, in any town that was passed over by whatever version of the railroad currently determines who gets to thrive and who has to leave in the dark. The little house was not always little by choice. Sometimes it was a basement room, one among many other bad options, the best that a family under enormous structural pressure could manage in a terrible year. and the little girl who lived in that room grew up and wrote a version of her childhood that left it out entirely. She built something beautiful from the parts of her life that fit the frame she was building for. That is a human thing to do. A completely, painfully, recognisably human thing to do. But the room is still there. And now, so is the rest of the story. This is the end of the series. Sartant, you have been listening to the full story of the year that vanished. From Walnut Grove to the Midnight Road, from the hotel basement to the doctor's offer, from the covered wagon in the dark to the building that is still standing in Burr Oak, Iowa, waiting for anyone who wants to walk through its door and see for themselves what the books left out. Sleep well.